Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is going to be my Svelte in 20 minutes video. So the goal here is to teach you as much of Svelte as I can in the next 20 minutes. If you're not familiar with Svelte, it is a front-end framework like Vue, like Angular, the two previous frameworks I've done one of these 20-minute videos on. And it plays kind of the same role in the sense that it is there to take over the building of your front-end part of your application. Okay, so instead of having like your back end handle creating your front end through templating, okay, and then kind of sprinkling some jQuery and some JavaScript in there, what you do is you're just letting JavaScript take over the entire rendering of the front end. So instead you're shipping basically a basic HTML file that just loads a JavaScript file, and that JavaScript file essentially constructs the whole page and all the changes in the page. The beauty of this is, again, you don't have to make a separate request to a server every time you go to another page. The whole application's already been loaded in the user's browser, making it a lot more snappy and quick. Also, a lighter load on the server. The catch, not necessarily ideal for search engine optimization. Little bit more work to keep it secure. But that's where like that sort of higher level frameworks comes in. So for like Next, it's Next.js. For Vue, it's Nux. For Svelte, it's SvelteKit. But that's a conversation for another day. So basically, let's create a Svelte project. Okay, so let me cd back up into this main folder. Okay, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use the Vite project generator. So to use that, you just do npm init Vite or Vite. Okay, and we're gonna call this my first Svelte app, and we're gonna have Svelte, and then we're gonna say the normal Svelte template that generates the app. So see, now we have my first Svelte app, and now I'm gonna cd into my first Svelte app, do an npm install so it can install all the dependencies. And if you look in here again, this will be very similar to React, Vue, and Angular. They all generally have the same idea. Okay, it all starts with the index.html. Essentially, the index.html always just has like it's just basically an empty file. And there's this div usually with the ID of app. It doesn't really have to have the ID app. It could be any kind of some sort of identifying marker. But generally in the templates, it's always an ID of app. And then what happens, the source file is always like the main or index.js. And what that does, it targets that element. So see, it's getting that element by ID. And then what it does, it's going to mount the app component. Okay. So see, what this did is it mounted an app component, which was created through the app.svelte file, and it's mounting it in the location here. That's the target location. And that's essentially how the app works. So essentially, everything else will happen inside the app component. This is the same in Vue. This is the same in React. It's just basically, if you create everything within the app component, when you mount the app component on the page, there's your web page. Okay. So how does an app component look like? And think of a component as a chunk of web page. So you can make as many of these components as you want. Usually you're going to want to chop up your app into like little mini components. Like your nav bar might be a component. Your footer might be a component. The carousel might be a component. And they all get assembled within this app component that represents your entire application. Now this will be very similar to Vue, where you can do everything in one file. They're single file components is what they're referred to as. So generally you'll have a script tag to do any JavaScript you want to do, a main tag, or really it doesn't have to be literally any HTML that you want to be your HTML, your template, and then you can do a style tag for your styling. Okay. From what I can tell in my previous experience, like this is not perfectly, it is kind of scoped, meaning like these styles will only apply to your, although you can play with that, but yeah, so it's going to be like a lot like Vue, where basically everything is kind of self-contained. The cool thing about Svelte, though, unlike Vue, is that it really just kind of leans a lot on just pure sort of JavaScript syntax. It doesn't really introduce a lot of having to do things very differently than you would in normal JavaScript. So unlike React, you don't have to like getters and setters and all this stuff with hooks. Unlike Vue, you don't have to like create this one big object and just store everything inside this big giant object. You just write JavaScript. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to first, let's just run npm run dev. That's going to run the dev server. How do I know that? I read the package.json and I can see the different scripts that are available to this template. And when I run that, that's going to allow me to go to localhost 3000 and I can see the app. Okay, so that's your basic app. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe this all out. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of all these styles. Okay, but theoretically you could use that style tag to style it. And again, all the stuff. See, now this is without all the styles. I'm going to get rid of pretty much all the HTML. Just get rid of all that. Okay, and I'm going to wipe out all the stuff in the JavaScript. So basically we have the minimum sort of starting point for a Svelte component. And again, I can just kind of be like h1 hello world. And see, that's it. There we go. I'll make sure to just pin this over here so we can see the whole thing at any given time. And that's as simple as it gets. You don't have to put any kind of JavaScript. You don't have to export like an object like you do with Vue. It's just call it .svelte, and you can write some HTML, and that's good enough. Now what you can basically, let's create another folder to create more components. So a folder called components is typically the way to go. And in this component, we'll create a new file, and we'll call it counter.svelte. And that'll be our counter component. Okay, and again, I can just start it off with a script tag. Okay, then I will have we'll just have a div. Again, it doesn't really matter which tag you use. And then we'll have a style tag. And you don't even have to bother putting the style tag. If you're not going to use it, you can just exclude it. Okay, so that's kind of what makes Svelte really simple. It's just really, really minimal on things you want to do. So there's certain patterns that are typical to these frameworks. One is, let's first is the ability to just kind of inject data into the template. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to say let count equals 0. Okay, and we're just going to say h1. And then here, to inject that variable into the template, I just write count with curly brackets. And there it goes. So now that's pretty much going to give me 0. So let me actually inject it into the app component so we can see it on the page. So it's simple. It's just importing the component. So I'll just say import counter from ./components/counter. Okay, and then I can just be, just like in React or Vue, I can just use that component like an HTML tag, counter. Okay, and there we go. See, it's now visible. I can see that. Okay, so we can inject our data into our template pretty straightforwardly. Another pattern is the ability to receive props. Again, props are generally passed in when we use our components like HTML tags. So I could pass in a prop called cheese equals Gouda. Okay, so the idea here is I can take this information and pass it to the component. So right now it's complaining because I've never defined this particular prop. But the way you do it is actually pretty straightforward. You just export a variable. So I would just say export let cheese. And this, by exporting the variable, that allows Svelte to be aware that this is intended to be a prop. So see, now it's not going to complain anymore because it knows, hey, the component in which I'm trying to pass cheese to has a variable to receive it. Okay, and then I can then go ahead and just use it. So h2, okay, I can just then use cheese in the template and see Gouda. And again, just like any component in any of these frameworks, I can then use it multiple times. Okay. Actually, I'll keep that cheese. What I want to change is this Munster. And I can create as many copies of this component as I want. That's the beauty of component-based design. I can create reusable components. But you see the syntax here is so much more simpler than you doing Vue or React. That's why Svelte is so killer. Okay, it's really, really straightforward. Now, the other thing we generally always run into is the idea of state. So the idea is hey, we have certain variables that might change, and if they change, we want to update the UI. So in React, we had state, and then every state had a separate set state function that we would use to update the variable and trigger the component updating. In Vue, we had a data object. Or if you use the composition API, you would have to create like a ref. But the idea is that when that variable changed, it would update. Here you don't do anything special. The fact that I created a reassignable variable tells Svelte that this is state. So anytime that variable updates, it should re-render the UI. So in that case, all I need to do is if I want to update it, is I'll just create a function. We'll say add1. So I don't have to do anything special. I'll just create a function that literally just increments counter. So we'll just say count plus equals 1. The only catch is you want to make sure that you're doing an assignment. So doing like, I think like doing an increment, I may or may not count. So I want to do this because this is going to count as an assignment, which will trigger the re-render. So now what happens is I can attach this event by just saying like, oh my god, it's been a sec. I think it's like on, yeah, we just do like on dash colon click. So I just do on click equals, and then we pass in the function. We just say add1, just like that. Okay, so now if I click on the H1, so if I click on the H1 for the first time I use the component, and see each one has their own tracks their own individual counter. That's the other beauty of reusable components. Each component generally has its own unique state. So even though I defined it in one file, since I've used it twice, each one kind of has their own copy of all these. This is like an independent copy of all this. And every time I click on it, it's triggering this function. All it's doing is adding 1 to count, and it updates. I don't have to use a weird set state function. I don't have to package all these variables into some object or create some function that returns these weird versions of these variables. I just define it. I just declare the variable, and anytime I change it, the DOM is going to update. Simple as that. Okay? So props is pretty simple. State's pretty simple. Creating a component's really simple. There's a reason why Svelte is so popular. Like, I mean, look, we've kind of covered the same thing we've covered in the other 20-minute videos here at the 13-minute mark. So, you know, you can see like constructing stuff here. And I mean, of course, you also have directives, but you don't have them in the same way you have them in like Vue and Angular, okay, where they're pretty much like HTML attributes. Here, a lot of those directives are actually going to look more like templating, like if you were used to using something like Jinja or Liquid or something like that. So for example, if I created an array, const r equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I wanted to loop through that, I would just create, if I remember right, it should be like each, and then it should be like num of r, or I think it's like num in r. I'm thinking I'm gonna have to double check that. It's late in the day. Svelte each. Okay, each blocks. Cats as cats. Okay. So that means this would be R, which means the array, as nums, or num. So then what happens is that within this block here, and then I can just end it by just doing a slash each here, that ends it. It'll just repeat this block here for every item in the R array. So then I can just do like h3, and then just inject num here. Because again, num is sort of my iterator variable. And then if I go back here, look, there it is. Each one has their 1 through 7. Okay, which is pretty nice. It makes it pretty clear, like I'm saying, hey, repeat this block. So there's the same thing with like if statements. So there's like a if, so you can do conditional rendering. So again, if you're coming from server-side templating, it's going to have a kind of a very natural feel. Like it's just going to feel like you're just doing a much more straightforward way of doing what you've been doing, but in the front end, instead of having your server render the page. So Svelte is again pretty straightforward. It has a lot of other like kind of nice bells and whistles, but I mean this is essentially like the meat that gets the bulk of the job done. Okay, you just literally add events like this. You can do loops like this. You just literally declare a reassignable variable, and then that's reactive. You export a variable if you want it to be considered props, and then you can just pass in props like you do it in React or Vue. And that's Svelte. Okay, so we literally covered Svelte in 15 minutes. So yeah, Svelte is great. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.